Welcome to another solo show. I'm walking in the sunshine, heading away this time from Lewes. I've already walked into Lewes from Glynde, and it's a beautiful sunny day. Pretty much a cloudless sky, which is pretty remarkable for January. Hello, just trying to work out what that is. Looks like a little skylark. Don't normally see them close to the ground. There we are. So, yes, this little route takes me past a fort. Iron Age fort, probably even earlier than that, I guess. And there's some obviously incredible scenery here, which, because I've got the camera on, this is only on audio, you won't be able to see, but the incredible sort of rolling hills of the South Downs. So I was just pondering a few things as I was sort of winding up on this book project and things, and I was contemplating this thing about desire, as you do, and where that is in the creative process. And I think it's fairly safe to say that if you look around at nature, it is desire that makes everything happen. And it's a constant, as they would put it, fecundity of nature, that everything is trying to reproduce, to grow, to stake its place in the world. And of course we're no different. But where we sort of differ is how we deal with desire, because of course it's looked upon from within religion as being problematic, or even just being sinful and evil. But of course we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for desire. In fact, nothing would happen if it wasn't for desire. Desire for money, desire for material things, desire for happiness, that sort of driving force. And of course, we give it this sort of rather tame notion of motivation, which is pretty pathetic really when you think about it. Desire, in all of its manifestations, whether that's a desire for protection, happiness, protection of your children, desire for children, desire that they have a good life, and all the rest of it. And of course, desire in itself is just a thing. What it leads to can be quite varied. Could lead to some very ugly situations, or can lead to some very beautiful situations. It's sort of amoral. So where I'm particularly fascinated by this is, of course, within the process of creating and being artistic or being musical, same thing obviously, and when you, from my personal experience, my most creative periods of time was when I'd fallen in love. It sounds a bit cheap and cheerful, but that is true. When somebody becomes your muse, and they are the most powerful periods of time creatively for me. Another period of time, as I outlined in a previous solo show, was the desire to be here, still be alive. And of course we take life for granted until of course it's almost taken away from us, and then we sort of get back with the desire to live life to the full. So I'm sure when you look at it this way, putting this sort of NLP hat on, is how do you harness that without having to start a new relationship or putting yourself on the point of of your own destruction, and then coming out the other side in order to get the creative tap turned on. And obviously we can do this, but it's a case of being able to get that mindset orientated in that particular way. Now, before I say that, let's have a look at the way that sort of thing of desire is harnessed in society. And it's not just obviously this one, every society's done it. If we have a look at the sort of medieval thing, desire was looked upon as being, as I said, problematic. There were obviously sanctions about when you could eat, and fasting and all of that, sort of dealing with the desire for food, when it was a suitable time to have sexual relationships. Obviously you couldn't do that outside of marriage. Well, people did obviously, but it wasn't looked upon favourably. But then of course if you look into more traditional societies, they have a form of control called, as a taboo. Now, taboos are very interesting because they are used in sort of magical thinking. To break a taboo is a very powerful act. So, and this obviously goes into shamanic cultures and all the rest of it, where part of the way that the shaman works is by doing the things that shouldn't be done, saying the things that are not to be said. And of course in medieval courts we had the jester or the fool who could speak truth to power without losing his head. So there is a tradition of taboo breaking in that sense, but of course there's also sexual taboo breaking, which you could look at within things like tantric sex and sex magic. Now, I'm interested in the way that generates thinking patterns that are different, which create new possibilities. And that to me is an interesting sort of exploration of our human consciousness. I'm sure, at some time in your life, most people have considered why we, or perhaps they haven't, I don't know, but why we have certain codes of conduct and things which change. When I grew up, it was frowned upon for people to be gay, which in its own way was a taboo breaker, and certainly if you read any of Crowley's work, that is definitely part of how he conducted himself. So once we sort of get the idea of where the on and off switches are, we can sort of look at what it is that happens with that sort of flow of creative power. So, sort of picking up from on that idea, let's consider looking at a period in your own life where you felt really creative, and we need to put it back into context. So you need to sort of consider what was happening in your life generally. What was happening in your relationships. If you were working or you were at school or whatever, what it was that made those, contributed to the condition. And it might not be because you were happy, it might have been because you had to get yourself out of a tight corner. I don't know. It's just a case of looking at the context that adds to that. And then see how that differs from a period of time where you just felt that you just didn't have any ideas at all. And again, look at your life and see what sort of different, see little key things that may differ in those, when you compare the two situations. Now, unfortunately, when we're born, we never come up with they never produced an owner's manual. So, and it's quite possible that we all have a slightly different owner's manual, and we need to discover how those things work for us. And not only that, of course, when you look at your own life, you look back in time, the person that you were 20 years ago or 10 years ago is not the same person as you are now. We always think that, we're the same person, but there are elements of us which obviously are the same. And you see that very early on with children, but you are physically different. All your cells of your body are totally different from what they were then. Maybe many of your ideas are totally different. You could almost be 180 degrees different from where you were before. And we just look at it and think, well, we learnt. But, maybe sometimes you need to look at it and think, well, we are actually very different people as time sort of goes on, yeah? So looking at that, see what it is. Spend a lot of time, let's say, in contemplation of that, and see how that manifests for you, and then try some things out. Try making some changes that bring into play some of those forces in you. Now, you may have to simulate something, of course, because let's say, for instance, you had a situation where, I don't know, let's take something hypothetical, like somebody was dying, and you started to write lots of poetry about people and all the rest of it. Now, you obviously can't make that happen again unless life throws that at you. But you could be nearer to people who are dying, so maybe do some sort of charity work or something like that for people who are near to death, and see, being close to that environment again, how that sort of changes you. There's one idea. Here's another idea. Let's say that you found yourself really motivated and everything because you had a friend who was a great influence on you, who you don't see anymore, or you see but their life has changed, and you think, well, there was a period of time where we did this amazing songwriting and all the rest of it. Try to rekindle that and see if you can get a little bit of that spark back, see what happens there. So the next thing is obviously, new relationships. I was talking to somebody a little while ago, and he was saying that he's now engaged to somebody else, and he had a period of time. He'd had a family, and a period of time where obviously his marriage collapsed and whatever. And he said there were lots of things in retrospect happened in that period of time where things changed, and that period leading up to the divorce and everything was, by the sounds of it, he didn't go into detail, but it sounded pretty bleak, and a lot of his life became not so creative on the outset, and then as soon as that changed, he made some dramatic changes in his life. So that's the type of thing that you can sort of toy around with, instead of just sitting there bemoaning the fact that you've got no ideas. You can actually make some changes happen, and just keep a little note of these things. Keep a journal and see what that brings when you start looking back at that, and see what you learn from yourself within that experience. So, returning to the idea now of sort of taboos and things where the powers that be want to limit your desire, unless of course they're going to sell you things, of course, and take your money off you, which of course is sort of what happens now. If you think about how desire works, it's monetized. So, and obviously a lot of historical things about the curbing of immoral behaviour was always very ambiguous throughout history. Obviously I can only speak for Britain here, because I don't know the sort of rules in other countries, but even when you had periods of time where, well, there was a sort of a cyclic thing for a start, where you would have highly sort of moral behaviour, and then it would come out of that into a very sort of permissive society, and then it would go back into a very moralistic society again. So you obviously coming out, like for instance the Puritans, into that period of the Reformation, the Renaissance, get this right, can't think of the word, when Charles II came back, the Restoration is the word I'm looking for, then obviously that became really the period of the libertines, really, in this country, where you had some characters who were up to all extraordinary behaviour, and although it was technically frowned upon, it just went on, whereas in the period before that it would have been very, it would have been punishable. And then of course you get eventually the period of the Victorians, with all their prudery. But of course, in those periods of time where there was that sort of prudish thing, of course that was under the surface, there was all this stuff going on. So really, to some extent, it was life as normal. And because obviously human nature is human nature. And so first of all, we got that sort of thing of how that operates. So, but this sort of idea of trying to curtail people's behaviour and desire. There's an interesting point that when you get those periods of time, sort of pre-Second World War Germany, before the Nazis came to power, was that one of those sort of times where you've got an incredibly creative period of time in Germany before it all goes completely wrong. Same thing with Russia, actually, with political thinking and extraordinary artistic output, and then you get Bolshevism. So within that there is something which I just sort of putting it out there because who's to say? I don't know, but there's certainly something that you could look at and think, well, that's interesting. So maybe that link between freedom of behaviour and expression and desire leads to this sort of flowering of extraordinary creativity, and of course that also means that there is a threat to the people in power, and the powers that be, of course, will look at that sort of thing and go, this is an immoral behaviour. Historically, the Chinese Empire always used to look up the poets and artists first. So there is something within that way of freedom of speech being disseminated through art, and of course it's very difficult because it's not direct, or shouldn't be direct. I mean, obviously when I teach people to write songs, if they ever write protest songs, they're always too direct and they never sound right. The great protest songs of the 60s were much more obscure because obviously these people would have been rounded up, especially in America, because they'd only just got over the McCarthy era. So things are indirect, but people know, of course, what the stories or the songs or the artwork is about, and of course that is subversive, and a danger to those in power. Never changes, does it? Never changes. So let's have a look at that now. Just as a little bit of a catch my breath a bit, because this is quite a climb here. I'm heading sort of near Glynde. So any of you who know anything about classical music, opera, Glynde is an important place where, as they say, the fat lady sings. And I used to live in a house very close to Glynde, on the opposite side of the road. How many houses down? About a quarter of a mile away, I suppose, if that, a third of a mile. I was about the third or fourth house down from Glynde. So sometimes it was difficult to get home as the culture vultures left. So yeah, interesting. And Glynde itself, the actual building, is absolutely hideous. Inside it's obviously amazing, but of course it just looks like an extraordinary concrete block just stuck next to this beautiful stately home. So whoever gave it planning permission Probably earned a few bob, I think, because it looks like some sort of Stalinist bit of architecture. Anyway, that's enough of that. So yeah, the sun's sort of shining over Mount Caban, where there's a hill fort, and if ever you had to march up here to fight a battle, you're absolutely knackered by the time you got up here. So, you know, they knew a thing or two, these people. So at the moment there's just sheep and a few people like me wandering around, heading to, you know, enjoying the sun basically. Right, so back to creativity and desire. So think about those things, you know, contemplate how your creativity can be influenced by those sort of feelings, and see where that takes you. Always interested to know whether anybody takes me up on some of these little challenges. Yeah, so with that, I'm going to carry on walking, enjoying the sun, and I wish you all the very best. Information on the show notes as always, and lots of other interesting people coming up on the show soon. Speak to you then.